All right, so part two of what will hopefully not be more than two parts because we keep getting interrupted. And it didn't like it last time I tried to put it on airplane mode, so we'll just have to cross our fingers. Where was I? Ideas and issues? I had very, very briefly laid out black nationalism as the concept of a nation within a nation. And also a rejection of the idea that the sort of paramount goals should be integration. Certainly an outgrowth of Garvey's idea of the new Negro, and an outright rejection of the idea that you ought to adopt or adapt to white culture and instead celebrate the culture of your African heritage and build upon that. Also, I mentioned, I think right before we lost the video, the concept of armed self-defense and a rejection of the philosophy of nonviolence. Add to that, and this dovetails with black nationalism, economic independence. The idea that fundamentally nothing was going to change. You could integrate, white businesses. You might even integrate schools or other public accommodations, but fundamentally nothing was going to change if you didn't control the actual economic resources of your own community. If you look around the country and you look at black neighborhoods in the city and white people own all the businesses in that neighborhood and white people sit on the city council and the county commission. And so the ideas of black nationalism, what would eventually become black power, would say what we need is to control the economic and political institutions in the neighborhoods in which we live. And that focusing simply on integration was, you might say, a red herring, something that oughtn't to be of paramount importance, but had been made to seem important by a few people. Malcolm X also preached the idea that black is beautiful, and that things like the word Negro were denigrating and had been passed down by white people as a way of hearkening back to the days of slavery and the supposed docility, that is, the idea that good black people were docile and friendly to white people and cared about them, and the politics of respectability associated with Booker T. Washington, which people like Malcolm X would reject out of hand. And also the word Negro, Malcolm X and others would argue, separated black Americans from the rest of their brothers and sisters in the African diaspora. So Pan-Africanism is also part of Malcolm X's message. Remember, we talked about Pan-Africanism when we talked about Garvey, the idea that black people the world over ought to work together and see themselves as one, as the children of that continent who had been spread throughout the Western Hemisphere as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. And so black people in Latin America and the Caribbean and back in Africa itself ought to see themselves working in concert together with African Americans. I mentioned earlier that he rejected, Malcolm X did, integration, the philosophy of nonviolence. He was often a critic of Martin Luther King and others in the civil rights movement, whom he sometimes derided as, quote, chumps and sellouts. He was great with a turn of phrase, and when you listen to the Ballad of the Bullet speech, you'll see that. He was a great rhetorician, great with rhetoric, great with his words and his delivery, and oftentimes channeling the great philosophers of the Enlightenment. And maybe it's unfair or wrong to connect Malcolm X with white people of the Western intellectual canon, but I can't help but think about someone like Voltaire when you look at the writings and oratory of Malcolm X, and he derides the March on Washington as the farce on Washington. Or he says things like, we didn't land, meaning Black Americans, we didn't land on Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock landed on us, and so on. He would go so far as to occasionally advocate for revolution. He sympathized sometimes with communists. He embraced the connections as such, whereas those in the nonviolent movement were often at great pains to distance themselves from revolutionary ideas like revolutionary socialism or communism. But he would become something of a counterpoint to Martin Luther King, John Lewis, and others. Something of a beacon, if you will, for others to follow if the philosophy of nonviolence didn't speak to them, to the burning desire, perhaps, the anger, the anguish in their hearts. Malcolm X gave them someone else to look to. And I'm going to steal a little bit here from a journalist named Taylor Branch, who's written a 3-part series of books on, it's subtitled America in the King Years. And so it's simultaneously a biography of Martin Luther King and also the story of America during the classical phase. I'm going to borrow from one of the titles of those, but all of the titles hearken to Scripture. And so, for example, the first book is entitled Parting the Waters. And look, think back, and I don't know how much I said about this because we began with Reconstruction in this class. And if this were African American History 1, I would have said a lot more about this. But when tasked black people, enslaved black people in America, when they took up Christianity, they latched on to certain elements of the Christian theology and the Christian story that spoke to them, particularly in the Old Testament. I mean, what would speak more to a people enslaved than the story of the Israelites held captive in Egypt who were delivered into a promised land by Moses? And the idea that a Moses could lead you out of slavery and captivity and part the waters of the Red Sea and lead you into Canaan. And so that story really resonated historically with black people. And so the title of Branch's first book is Parting the Waters, and the idea of Martin Luther King as some sort of Moses. But the second book is as much about Malcolm X as it is about Martin Luther King. And it presents the idea that by the mid-1960s, black people in America had 2 individuals that they could follow, depending on what spoke to their heart. And Branch deliberately channels this passage of Scripture, which, as part of the Old Testament, would also be, this is from Exodus. And so this story would not be totally alien to either the Jewish Hebrew Torah or to the Quran of Islam. I want to find the one. Obviously, these things can be translated from the original Hebrew in a little bit different way into English. Here we go. By day, the Lord went ahead of them in a column of smoke to lead them on their way. By night, he went ahead of them in a column of fire to give them light so that they could travel by day or by night. Branch was taking from this the concept that perhaps by the mid-60s you had a column of smoke to follow by day or a pillar of fire to follow by night, and those representing either Martin Luther King or Malcolm X. The latter eventually leaves the Nation of Islam. He and Elijah Muhammad had a falling out. Malcolm X becomes a tremendously both popular and controversial public figure, and I think a lot of the falling out was that Elijah Muhammad was jealous of all the publicity, the screen time, if you will, that Malcolm X got. Also, Malcolm X begins to see Elijah Muhammad as something of a hypocrite. He preached these, as I said, to borrow the Christian idea, these Puritan values of moral and righteous living, and yet he himself lived a life of infidelity, extramarital affairs, misuse of funds that were coming into the Nation of Islam. And just generally not sort of practicing what he preached. On the flip side, Elijah Muhammad had founded the Nation of Islam as a religious organization and not a political one, and it was very clear that Malcolm X saw his life and his career as being overtly political. And so in the eyes of Elijah Muhammad, he's politicizing an organization that was not intended to be political. So when Malcolm X leaves and ends up actually rejecting a lot of the teachings of Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam, he forms his own organizations, the one being the Organization of African American Unity, and the other being Muslim Mosque Incorporated. These are Malcolm X's own independent organizations. After his departure from his split with the Nation of Islam. One of the 5 pillars of Islam is that if you are able to, in your lifetime, you should undertake the Hajj. You should undertake a pilgrimage to the Muslim holy city of Mecca in present-day Saudi Arabia and visit the Kaaba, perhaps the holiest site of all in Islam. And Malcolm X does that and has something of a transformation after he undertakes the Hajj. He ends up changing his stance on integration. He ends up rejecting a lot of the overtly sort of anti-white teachings of the Nation of Islam. He takes the name El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz and undertakes a real pivot in his philosophy, not entirely away, certainly not away from the concepts of black nationalism and armed self-defense, but away again from some of the more hardline stances of the Nation of Islam and of Elijah Muhammad. Speaking of, in February of 1965, he appears in New York City on stage, and that will be his last appearance as he is gunned down by men with shotguns operating on orders of the Nation of Islam, perhaps of the highest leadership of the Nation of Islam. It's speculated, was it Elijah Muhammad? Was it his second in command, Louis Farrakhan? They denied it, but certainly no one would deny that it was the work in some way or another of the nation. The execution, the assassination of Malcolm X. And here, let me check the link. How compelling.
Good grammar and spelling are important, but if
it's important. Okay, so that's still good. So listen to this. I'll run down a few of the main ideas. This is a speech Malcolm X gives in 1964 in Detroit, a city he was familiar with, of course, in which he lays out the principles of black nationalism. He calls himself a black nationalist freedom fighter. as would be evident from his leaving the Nation of Islam and founding these new institutions, he tries to separate his faith from his politics. And says, look, I'm a Muslim, but that's my personal business. And that doesn't necessarily inform my position as a black nationalist freedom fighter. I keep my religion at home. And then he goes on again to lay out the fundamental principles of black nationalism and economic independence. Black people need to be able to control the politics and the politicians in their community. They need a political program of re-education. They need to control the economic resources of their community. We talk about housing, education, jobs. He talks about black people needing to keep their money within their own communities in the cases in which black people do control the economic resources. In other words, don't go spend your money in white businesses outside the community. He derided or criticized the nonviolent movement for boycotting and picketing some cracker, as in white person. So that's an ignorant thing to do. That's the enemy. Why do you want to go into their store? Why do you want to spend your money there? Among the great rhetorical turns in this speech that I mentioned before, he is fantastic with a turn of phrase. He speaks to these, he's speaking Christian church, by the way. One of the reasons he sort of lays out up front, look, I'm a Muslim, but don't reject me because that doesn't have necessarily anything to do with my politics, and I'm here to talk to you about my politics. He says, they don't hate you because you're a Baptist, they hate you because you're black. And again, criticizing the nonviolent movement, he says, it's time to stop singing and start swinging. And of course, the concept of the ballad or the bullet is a rhetorical device as well. What he is arguing in this speech is, and in calling this the year of the Ballad of the Bullet, 1964, is that, look, either you're going to see the ballot, meaning representing real political power for black Americans, the ability to vote and elect candidates of your own choosing, and to have that political and economic power. Either you're going to have that this year, says Malcolm X, or you're going to see violence. The Ballad of the Bullet. He argues that white liberals in America had failed black people up to that point. And would argue we need a do it for ourselves program and a do it right now program. And again, criticizing the nonviolent movement and throwing some shade at the concept of a sit-in. He says, we've been sitting long enough and it's time to do some standing. And then he channels the concept of Pan-Africanism and harkens over to nationalist movements in Africa and Asia, movements that in places like India and South Africa had seen nations become independent after being colonized and subjected to the exploitations of imperialism. And says, why not take a cue from them? And says, in fact, we as black Americans have suffered our own form of colonialism, second-class citizenship, 20th century slavery, as he would describe it. And that's when he begins to elucidate what he means specifically by the year of the Ballad of the Bullet. Black people were disenchanted, disillusioned. America had become a racial powder keg, that is, metaphorically like a barrel full of gunpowder waiting to explode. He channels American history. He says, look at the American revolutionaries. He said, do you think George Washington was some sort of advocate of nonviolence? What about Patrick Henry, the American revolutionary who said, give me liberty or give me death? So these people are not nonviolent. Nonviolence is not at the core of American history. Armed self-defense is at the core of American history. And he said, forget the odds. The odds were against those 13 colonies banding together as one against the mighty British Empire. But he says, look at what's happened since. You and I, he says, to other black people, have not seen democracy, only hypocrisy, lies. We haven't experienced in the 20th century the American dream. It's been for us an American nightmare. Presaging the era of latter 20th century mass incarceration, he says, look, if you're black, you were born in jail in America. And as long as you're south of the Canadian border, you're south. You're in the South, meaning exploding the myth of Southern exceptionalism, as we would say. The idea that it's not just the South that has at its core racial discrimination, inequality, white supremacy. It's the American nation. He mocks anyone who would support the Democratic Party as a chump and a traitor to their race. A race hustler, perhaps, if you will. And reminds them that the Democratic Party is also the Dixiecrat Party. That is the party of the white South still. That was about to change, but he didn't quite know the extent to which that would be the case, and certainly not in 1964. He calls on black people to develop their political maturity. And he insists, look, there's no such thing as a nonviolent revolution. Revolutions overturn systems. Revolutions are bloody. But, he says, in closing, this country can avoid that. You can avoid the fate of the metaphorical bullet and the explosion of the metaphorical powder keg. But it's got to mean real political and economic power, and now. As we're about to see when I transition to this next PowerPoint, Malcolm X's words in this speech were incredibly prophetic. And look, Malcolm X is not up there saying, I'm calling for violence and violence now. What he's doing is predicting what is going to happen if things don't fundamentally change. And the very next year, the year that he was murdered, it became abundantly clear that he was absolutely right. For that would begin, if it had not already begun in 1963, a reckoning with race in America, the likes of which we have not seen since until perhaps this very year, 2020. So now I want to, with what time we have left, talk about Black Power as best I can. We'll talk about this individual, which Professor Thomas mentioned when she was in here a moment ago. That is Stokely Carmichael. We'll talk about this organization, and that is the Black Panther Party. No need to review here, as we've just been talking about Malcolm X and black nationalism and this idea of the ballot or the bullet. And so let's move right on to Mr. Carmichael. Stokely Carmichael was born in the Caribbean, in Trinidad. He moves to the United States at the age of 11, becomes active as a young man in the civil rights movement while attending Howard in Washington, D.C. He eventually joins SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He was one of the original Freedom Riders with John Lewis and Diane Nash at 19 years old. As did most of the Freedom Riders, he served time in jail in Mississippi, 49 days in Jackson. He was mentored in voting rights activism by Ella Baker, who we talked about, Bob Moses in Mississippi, who we talked about before. But after the failure of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and their challenge to the Democratic Party establishment, remember we talked about Fannie Lou Hamer and the MFDP and their attempt to say, we are the representative Democratic Party of the people of Mississippi, not the white establishment party, but that failed, as you'll recall. Stokely Carmichael becomes disillusioned with the two-party system. That is, he becomes convinced that it is a failure, it's failed black people, and that their efforts to work within it were futile. And he resolves to do grassroots work and organize outside the system. He goes as a field organizer to the Black Belt of Alabama, to Lowndes County, which has been described by a historian now as Bloody Lowndes. Because of the violence, of course, that white people would use to protect white supremacy there. Lowndes County is down here, west of Montgomery. County lines, regrettably, are not there, but there is Lounsboro, which is in the heart of that county. So it sits between Montgomery and Selma. There, he works with local people in order to attempt to get them to register to vote. And you mentioned earlier, one of the things that impressed upon you in this class the last few weeks was the lengths to which white people went in the South to prevent black people from registering to vote or being able to cast their vote, and how apropos to be reminded of that on election day. So Carmichael is in Lowndes County, the belly of the beast, organizing voter registration drives and working with local people, and he helps form with them the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, the chosen symbol of which was a Black Panther. The idea being that a panther will back up until it is cornered, and when it is cornered, it will come out fighting for life or death. The idea here was that black people in the Black Belt constituted an overwhelming majority of the population, but none of them could vote. The idea was to try to take advantage of that massive numerical superiority, but of course, because white people are outnumbered and they understand that, they are keenly aware of that, they clung to white supremacy more tightly and violently than white people anywhere else. It's as it was, as I discussed, in Mississippi. And so, of course, anybody who's working with Carmichael and Lowndes County is met with, at a minimum, what we call economic reprisal. White people understood that they controlled the economic resources, and of course, as you just saw, Malcolm X knew that too. And that this is a great power that they could exercise. If you own all the homes and all the farmland and all the banks and all the businesses, if you know of some individual locally who's working with Stokely Carmichael to try to register people to vote, and they live on land owned by a white person, they could get evicted. If they're a farmer and they have to go to the bank to get a loan for the year to make it through the year, they could be denied that credit. They could have existing loans called upon them. If they had a business of their own, but they paid rent in some space downtown, they could be kicked out of town, out of their building. You know, if they worked for a white person doing anything, they could be fired. Their names could be published in the local newspaper so people would know who's trying to stir up trouble, who's working with these outside agitators to stir up trouble. But of course it wasn't limited to that. There's extreme violence. Carmichael himself was arrested and turned over to a lynch mob and would have been murdered had he not escaped. 2 others didn't escape, and one of them was killed. Despite all of this, he was able to raise the number of registered black voters in Lowndes from a mere 70 people to 2,600 people, and then would return to SNCC as chairman in 1966, replacing John Lewis. With the sort of some bona fides now. He had been down in the South. He had done the dirty work. He had done what people like Bob Moses had done. In the field, if you will. The field of battle. Toe-to-toe with the enemy. Card for the Black Panther Party. And you'll perhaps recall that the rooster was a symbol of the white Democratic Party of the post-redemption South and stood for white supremacy. But their symbol was the Black Panther, which stands for courage, determination, and freedom. It was chosen as an appropriate response to the racist Alabama Democratic Party symbol, the white rooster, and its slogan, white supremacy for the right. And there is Stokely Carmichael holding a flyer with the rooster and the panther and saying, what do you want? And as with Malcolm X, I'll leave for you to click on the link there and listen to Mr. Carmichael. But just to make sure it's still good, and it appears to be. Carmichael in Greenwood, Mississippi, 1964.
Does scrubbing grease feel like a workout? Scrub less with Dawn Ultra. It's superior.
Awful. Okay. I was thinking we jumped forward significantly there. Sorry. So, I mentioned Carmichael will become chairman of SNCC in 1966, succeeding John Lewis, who would go on, of course, to serve in Congress. In that same year, 1966, James Meredith, who I mentioned in here before, who had desegregated the University of Mississippi, undertook what he called a walk against fear. He was going to walk from Memphis, Tennessee, to Jackson, Mississippi, through the heart of Mississippi and through what they call the Mississippi Delta, which, like the Black Belt of Alabama, is at the heart of white supremacy. Well, not surprisingly, he only made it 20 miles into that Mississippi Delta before he was shot multiple times. Stokely Carmichael, Martin Luther King, and others resolved to finish his march. And of course, once those two get involved, King was very much the national civil rights figure, and Carmichael, as the head of SNCC, had attained great national recognition by that point as well. Once these people get involved, it's a big deal. But it also becomes clear that there was a very wide and widening rift or separation between Martin Luther King, representing the older guard, and the more overtly Christian wing of the movement, and young people like Stokely Carmichael, who perhaps were leaning towards more the message of a Malcolm X than a Martin Luther King. During the march, when the more old school, nonviolent movement folk would shout freedom, the young people, the black nationalists, would reply with uhuru. Uhuru is a Swahili word that means the same, but very obviously chosen as a counterpoint and to represent the ideas of black nationalism and Pan-Africanism. The black nationalists, like Carmichael, welcome support from groups like the Deacons for Defense and Justice. This is an armed group of black people providing security for the marchers. Armed self-defense. This is something that made people like Martin Luther King very uncomfortable. Being as they were, supposedly anyway, philosophically committed to nonviolence. During the march, after being jailed in Greenwood, where you just saw when I clicked on the link, that's where Carmichael was speaking, he there becomes the first to articulate black power. He said, look, this is the 27th time that I've been arrested. I ain't going to jail anymore. We've been saying freedom for 6 years now. What we're going to start saying is black power. In his book, Black Power, The Politics of Liberation, he later explains it is a call for black people in this country to unite, to recognize their heritage, to build a sense of community. It is a call for black people to define their own goals and to lead their own organizations. This, of course, built upon the ideas of Malcolm X, which built upon the ideas of Marcus Garvey. Carmichael would soon oversee the expulsion of white people from SNCC and the commitment of that organization to this new philosophy. It becomes an exclusively black institution. And he and others begin to talk not about civil disobedience, but about revolution. Not surprisingly, he is targeted by the FBI's COINTELPRO program. And I don't think I have talked about COINTELPRO in here before, but the director of the FBI in America, J. Edgar Hoover, had targeted civil rights organizations, targeted people like Martin Luther King and John Lewis, kept surveillance on them, had very large files on them and their whereabouts and their beliefs and their actions, considered them to be hand in hand with communists and revolutionaries. And of course, if someone comes along like Carmichael, who is more radical than the people in the nonviolent movement, the FBI is going to target those individuals as well. And Hoover considered Carmichael to be the most likely to take Malcolm X's place as the leader of a black nationalist movement. And so Carmichael is faced with harassment from the FBI, from his own government, continued disillusionment with the possibility of systemic or fundamental change in America, and ultimately he will leave America and relocate to the West African nation of Ghana and take up the name Kwame Ture. Wow, man, LG's going to love that. I've got a marker that doesn't work literally at all. Questions about this or anything else up to this point? All right, well, let's do one more slide before we get out of here. We'll be able to finish this on Thursday. Black Power and other organizations. CORE, the leader of which by this time was Floyd McKissick, leads the expulsion of white people from CORE, and it's not a total F you, like we hate you now and don't want to work with you. It was a thanks for your help and being allies, but we need to do this ourselves. And you've seen it in SNCC with Carmichael, and you see it here with McKissick and CORE. 2, also, CORE, and you think about this is the organization that conceptualized the freedom rides, the quintessential early exemplar of nonviolence and civil disobedience. McKissick proclaims there is no possible return to nonviolence. James Farmer had become a top SNCC organizer. Said, if we can't sit at the table of democracy, we'll knock the fucking legs off. So you see the old line institutions of the nonviolent civil disobedient movement beginning to shift in profound ways towards something new. And that something new is Black Power. And new organizations begin to emerge. I mentioned the Deacons for Self-Defense and Justice. Also, the organization that would, borrowing from Stokely Carmichael's group in Lowndes County, take the name the Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party is formed in Oakland, California. 4 months after Stokely Carmichael's speech at Greenwood, in which he proclaimed Black Power, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale founded the Black Panther Party. They were students at a local college in Oakland, part of a group that was trying to get that college to approve the creation of a Black Studies department. The chief aim of the Black Panthers would be to protect the black community in Oakland from the all-white Oakland police, who were indiscriminate in their violence and harassment in black neighborhoods. The Panthers would adopt a sort of paramilitary look and dress, and the black leather and the berets. They carried unconcealed weapons and made a point of following around the police to keep tabs on them and what they were doing. Of course, this being many decades before body cams and such. And you think about what we've seen this year. Over and over and over again. And imagine a time where there were no cell phones and no body cams. And think about what police got away with in black neighborhoods and other neighborhoods of people of color, Latinos, Asians, whomever. This is why you had a need for the Black Panther Party. In their 10-point program, they channeled black nationalism, black power, the ideas of self-determination, the idea of full employment for black people, of better housing and education, an end to police brutality. Self-determination, full employment, better housing, education, an end to police brutality. Chapters began popping up all over the country. The Black Panthers would become a national organization and not just in Oakland. Yes, yes. For others, Black Power could mean something more cultural. It could mean a celebration of African cultural heritage. It might mean, an overt refusal to sort of dress or look white, if you will. To wear your hair in an afro or an afro puffs. To adopt some manner of African dress. To observe a holiday announced and devised by a black scholar known as Kwanzaa, an African-American holiday celebrating the 7 principles of Nguzo Saba. unity, self-determination, self-love.